The Millionaire's twins were blind, until the new black Maid did something that no doctor had ever achieved. If you love emotional, unforgettable stories that stay with you, don't forget to like and subscribe. We've got so many more coming your way. The crystal chandelier cast fractured light across marble floors as small fingers traced the intricate patterns of a Persian rug. 8-year-old Lily Harrington sat cross-legged, her pale blue eyes unseeing but focused, counting the tassels with methodical precision. Each silk strand felt different under her fingertips, some smooth, others slightly frayed from years of careful exploration. Her twin brother Lucas lay nearby on the cool marble, his head tilted toward the grandfather clock's rhythmic tick, memorizing time by sound alone. The clock's brass pendulum created a whisper of displaced air with each swing, a sensation he had learned to read like others might read numbers on a face. The mansion's morning silence was broken only by these small sounds: the soft brush of fingers against fabric, the measured breathing of children who had learned to navigate their world through senses most people ignored. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, painting patterns of warmth and shadow that the twins could feel but not see, creating a landscape of temperature and texture across their skin. "Children," came the sharp voice of their father's fiancée, Helena Ashworth. Her Louboutin heels clicked against the marble with military precision, each step announcing her approach from the far end of the grand foyer. The sound echoed off the vaulted ceiling, multiplying until it seemed like an army of disapproval marching toward them. "Breakfast is ready. No dawdling." Lily's fingers paused against the rug's intricate weave. She knew that tone: impatient, dismissive, edged with the particular kind of irritation Helena reserved for anything that disrupted her vision of their perfectly ordered household. The same tone Helena used when discussing the twins' situation with visitors, as if blindness were a shameful family secret rather than simply how they experienced the world. The children had learned to read the emotional weather of adults through subtle cues that escaped most people's notice. Helena's breathing was slightly elevated, suggesting she was running behind her carefully planned schedule. Her perfume, something expensive with notes of bergamot and white flowers, carried an undertone of stress that only became apparent when she was particularly agitated. Victor Harrington emerged from his study, the heavy oak door closing behind him with a soft thud that resonated through the floor. His Italian leather shoes made barely a whisper against the marble, a sound the twins had learned to distinguish from the sharper clicks of Helena's heels or the rubber-soled silence of the household staff. At 42, he commanded boardrooms and million-dollar deals with effortless authority, his presence filling rooms before he ever spoke a word. But watching his children navigate their world with careful, practiced movements, he felt the familiar weight of helplessness settle in his chest like a stone. "Morning, Dad," Lucas said, rising with the fluid grace of someone who had mapped every inch of their environment through touch and sound. His movement was economical, precise, no wasted motion, no uncertainty. He knew exactly where the rug ended and the marble began, could predict the slight rise in the floor where it transitioned to the dining room's hardwood. Victor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The children's cheerful acceptance of their limitations both broke his heart and frustrated him beyond measure. He had consulted with 17 specialists across 3 continents, flown them to experimental clinics in Switzerland and cutting-edge research facilities in Boston. The verdict was always the same: congenital cortical visual impairment, severe and bilateral. The damage had occurred before birth, affecting the parts of their brains responsible for processing visual information. Irreversible. Final. The words that had haunted his dreams for 8 years. The twins made their way to the dining room with practiced efficiency, their hands trailing along the mahogany banister they knew by heart. Every groove in the wood, every slight variation in the grain, served as landmarks in their mental map of the house. Lucas always sat to the left of their father's chair, Lily to the right, positions they had claimed as toddlers and maintained through an unspoken understanding. Both positioned so they could hear the kitchen door's soft whoosh when staff brought their meals, could detect the subtle change in air pressure that announced someone's approach. The dining room itself was a monument to wealth and taste. Hand-painted wallpaper depicting pastoral scenes, a table that could seat 20 carved from a single piece of mahogany, chairs upholstered in silk that cost more per yard than most people earned in a week. Crystal glasses caught the morning light, throwing tiny rainbows across surfaces the twins would never see, while silver serving pieces gleamed with a luster that existed only in the visual spectrum. "The new girl starts today," Helena announced, cutting into her grapefruit with surgical precision. The sound of the serrated knife against fruit and porcelain created a small symphony of breakfast efficiency, though I still think it's unnecessary. The twins manage perfectly well with the current staff. Her voice carried the particular edge it took on when she disagreed with Victor's decisions, but couldn't quite challenge them directly. Helena had been part of their lives for 2 years now, ever since she and Victor had met at a charity gala for children's hospitals. She was beautiful, accomplished, and understood the social requirements of being married to a man of Victor's stature. What she didn't understand, and had never tried to, was how to connect with children whose needs couldn't be addressed through careful scheduling and expensive specialists. Victor said nothing, but his silence carried weight. It was a silence the twins knew well, the kind that meant their father was thinking through implications and consequences, weighing decisions with the same careful consideration he brought to business deals. He had made the decision to hire additional help after noticing how isolated his children had become. Their laughter, once a regular soundtrack to the mansion's halls, had grown sparse over the past year. They moved through their days with mechanical efficiency, but little joy, like clockwork figures performing predetermined routines. The existing staff was competent, certainly. Maria Gonzalez had been with the family since before the twins were born, and she cared for them with genuine affection. But Maria's approach was protective, cautious, designed to keep the children safe rather than help them explore the boundaries of their capabilities. The physical therapist came twice a week for carefully supervised exercises. The occupational therapist focused on basic life skills. The tutors worked on academics adapted for blind students. Everyone was professional, qualified, and ultimately limited by their assumption that the twins' condition was something to be managed rather than challenged. The kitchen door opened with its familiar whisper of displaced air. But instead of Maria's familiar footsteps, quick, light, accompanied by the gentle rattle of dishes on a tray, a new rhythm entered the room. These steps were measured, confident, but somehow softer. They carried no anxiety, no rush to please or prove competence. Naomi Williams entered carrying the morning fruit service on a silver tray that caught the light streaming through the tall windows. She was perhaps 30, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. Her uniform was crisp and professional, but she wore it with a natural dignity that made it seem like a choice rather than a requirement. There was something in her posture that suggested strength without aggression, competence without show. "Good morning," she said simply, her voice warm but not effusive. The tone was conversational, natural, the way someone might speak to neighbors or friends rather than employers. "I'm Naomi." Helena barely glanced up from her systematic dissection of her grapefruit. "The children's routine is very specific. Maria will show you the details later. For now, just observe and learn." The dismissal was clear, but Naomi didn't seem affected by it. Instead of responding to Helena, she was watching the twins with professional interest. Not the careful, pitying observation most strangers directed at them, but the focused attention of someone trying to understand rather than simply catalog their limitations. Lily had tilted her head slightly at the sound of this new voice, her expression alert in a way it rarely was during morning routines. There was something different about how this woman spoke, not the careful, overly gentle tone most strangers used with them, not the brisk efficiency of medical professionals, but something more natural, more genuine. "What's your name?" Naomi asked, addressing Lily directly. The question hung in the air like a small revolution. Adults rarely spoke to the twins first. They usually discussed them with their father or Helena, as if blindness had somehow affected their ability to communicate or think for themselves. Visitors would often speak about them in third person while standing right beside them, discussing their condition and prognosis, as if they weren't present to hear every word. "Lily," came the soft reply, and there was something in her voice that hadn't been there moments before, a spark of genuine interest. "And that's Lucas. It's nice to meet you both." Naomi's words carried no trace of the patronizing sweetness most adults adopted when speaking to disabled children. She spoke to them as she would any 8-year-old children, with respect and natural warmth. Victor observed this exchange with growing interest. Something about Naomi's presence felt different from the parade of nannies, tutors, and specialists who had cycled through their lives over the years. She radiated a calm competence that didn't announce itself with unnecessary words or gestures. More importantly, his children were responding to her in a way he hadn't seen in months. They were present, engaged, curious rather than politely patient. Lucas, who had been quietly eating his cereal, looked up in Naomi's direction. "Are you going to take care of us like Maria does?" "I'm going to work with you," Naomi replied, and Victor noticed her careful choice of words. Not take care of, with its implications of dependency, but work with, suggesting partnership, collaboration. "What kinds of things do you like to do?" The question was so simple, so natural, that it took Victor a moment to realize how rarely anyone asked his children about their preferences rather than their needs. The twins exchanged a glance. One of those wordless communications that had developed between them over the years, a language of subtle movements and shared understanding that excluded the rest of the world. "We like music," Lucas said tentatively. "And textures, feeling different things. And patterns," Lily added. "Things that have order to them. Like the rug in the front hall. It has a pattern you can follow with your fingers." Naomi nodded thoughtfully, as if filing this information away for future use. "Those sound like interesting things to explore. Music has patterns too, doesn't it? And textures can be found everywhere if you know how to look for them." Helena's spoon clinked against her coffee cup with slightly more force than necessary, a small sound of disapproval that everyone at the table registered. "The children have very structured days," she said. "Their therapists have developed specific programs designed for their needs." "Of course," Naomi replied smoothly. "Structure is important. But there's usually room within structure for creativity and exploration." The comment was polite, professional, but Victor caught an undertone that suggested Naomi might have her own ideas about how to balance structure with stimulation. After breakfast, he retreated to his study to prepare for a conference call with Tokyo investors, but found himself distracted by thoughts of the new addition to their household staff. His study was his sanctuary within the mansion, a room lined floor to ceiling with first edition books, dominated by a massive desk carved from a single piece of Brazilian rosewood. The leather chairs were positioned to take advantage of the morning light streaming through tall windows that offered a view of the estate's 10 acres of meticulously maintained gardens. Rose gardens that his children had never seen in bloom, topiary mazes they could never visually appreciate, ornamental fountains whose dancing water patterns existed only in the realm of sound and spray for Lily and Lucas. An hour into his call with the Tokyo team, something unusual caught his attention. Voices drifted up from the garden, not the careful, instructional tones he was used to hearing during the twins' supervised outdoor time, but actual conversation. The sound of genuine engagement. And something else that made him pause mid-sentence during his discussion of quarterly projections. Laughter. Real laughter. Not the polite sounds the twins made when adults expected them to be amused, but the spontaneous, unguarded laughter of children who were actually enjoying themselves. Victor excused himself from the call and moved to the window. Below, Naomi sat on a stone bench with Lily and Lucas on either side of her. But instead of the rigid posture he expected from staff members during work time, the careful distance maintained between caregiver and charges, she was relaxed, engaged. The children weren't sitting in their usual careful positions either, back straight and hands folded in their laps. They were leaning forward, animated, their bodies expressing an enthusiasm he hadn't seen in months. "Feel this," Naomi was saying, pressing something into Lily's palm. "The texture's different from yesterday's rose petals. What do you notice?" Lily's face lit up with concentration, her expression more alive than Victor had seen it in recent memory. "It's fuzzy and thicker, like velvet, but alive." "That's lamb's ear," Naomi explained. "It's soft like velvet because thousands of tiny hairs cover the surface. They help the plant conserve water in hot weather. Now close your eyes. I know, but humor me and tell me what you smell." Lucas laughed, actually laughed, at the gentle joke. The sound sent a shock of recognition through Victor's chest. When had he last heard his son express genuine amusement rather than dutiful politeness? "Mint," Lucas said confidently. "But not like toothpaste mint. Sweeter." More green. Chocolate mint. Naomi confirmed. Your nose is better than most adults. Can you guess why this plant might smell like that? To attract something? Lily guessed. Or keep something away? Both, actually. The mint scent attracts beneficial insects while deterring pests. Plants are much smarter than most people realize. Victor found himself pausing his preparation for follow-up calls with London and Frankfurt. When had he last heard his children engaged in this kind of exploratory learning? Their tutors were excellent, certainly, but they focused on predetermined curricula, measurable outcomes. This was different. This was discovery-based learning, the kind that sparked curiosity rather than simply conveying information. The morning stretched into afternoon, and still the voices continued from the garden. At one point, Victor heard the sound of a ball bouncing. Not the careful, controlled exercises their physical therapist prescribed, with measured distances and predictable outcomes, but the irregular rhythm of play. Real play, with all its inherent uncertainty and joy. Naomi, I can hear it rolling toward the fountain. Lily called out, her voice bright with excitement. Excellent. Can you tell which direction it's moving by the sound? There was a pause as Lily concentrated. Left? No, wait. Right. It's bouncing off the stone, edging around the rose beds. Perfect. Now, Lucas, can you predict where it will go next? If it hits the fountain base, it should bounce back toward us, but… Lucas paused, his head tilted in intense concentration. The ground slopes slightly there, so it will curve toward the herb garden. Victor set down his phone entirely. His son was not only tracking a moving object by sound alone, but predicting its trajectory based on his understanding of the garden's topography. These were spatial reasoning skills that none of their expensive specialists had ever attempted to develop, partly because they had assumed the twins lacked the sensory input necessary to build such sophisticated mental maps. He watched as Naomi retrieved the ball and set up what appeared to be a more complex version of the game. She positioned various objects throughout a small section of the garden: wind chimes, wooden blocks, metal bowls, creating an obstacle course that existed entirely in the auditory realm. This time, she said, I want you to navigate to the fountain using only sound cues. But here's the challenge. You have to identify what each obstacle is made of before you move past it. Both twins approached this task with the serious concentration they usually reserved for academic work, but their body language was entirely different. Instead of the careful compliance they showed their tutors, they radiated genuine enthusiasm. They were problem-solving for the joy of it rather than to meet adult expectations. As Victor watched his children move through Naomi's improvised obstacle course, he began to understand that something fundamental was happening. This wasn't just play or even therapy. It was education of a different kind entirely. Naomi was teaching them to view their enhanced auditory and tactile abilities not as compensations for a missing sense, but as tools for gathering sophisticated information about their environment. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner in the formal dining room, Victor noticed subtle changes in the twins that went beyond their improved mood. Their posture was different, less guarded, more open. They still moved with their characteristic care, but there was something new in their bearing. Confidence, perhaps, or simply the relaxed alertness of children who had spent their day learning and exploring rather than simply being managed. The dining room's atmosphere felt different too. Usually, dinner was a careful orchestration of polite conversation and proper behavior, with the twins participating dutifully but without much enthusiasm. Tonight, there was an undercurrent of energy, an anticipation that suggested the children actually had things they wanted to share rather than responses they felt obligated to provide. How was your day? Victor asked, a question that usually elicited polite, brief responses along the lines of fine, thank you, or we did our lessons. We learned about plant textures, Lucas said immediately, his words tumbling out with genuine excitement. Did you know that rose petals feel different depending on when they bloom? The new ones are firmer, but the old ones are soft like tissue paper. And they smell different too. Stronger at night because that's when they're trying to attract nocturnal pollinators. And we played sound games, Lily added, her face animated in a way Victor hadn't seen in months. Naomi taught us how to tell which direction birds are flying just by listening to how their calls change as they move. And we learned that different materials reflect sound differently. Metal makes echoes sharp and clear, but fabric absorbs sound and makes everything seem closer. Victor felt something shift in his chest, a lifting sensation he hadn't experienced in years. His children weren't just reciting facts they had memorized, they were sharing discoveries they had made, insights they had developed through direct experience. The difference was profound and impossible to miss. Helena's fork paused midway to her mouth, her expression carefully neutral, but her posture telegraphing disapproval. Games are fine for entertainment, but let's not confuse them with education. The children have serious academic requirements that need to be met. The comment landed in the conversation like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples of tension throughout the room. Victor watched his children's faces change subtly, not closing off entirely, but dimming slightly as they registered the adult disapproval of something that had brought them joy. But Naomi, who had been quietly serving the second course with the professional invisibility expected of household staff, spoke up in a calm, measured voice. Actually, spatial audio processing and tactile discrimination are fundamental cognitive skills. The games help develop neural pathways that enhance navigation, environmental awareness, and memory formation. These abilities have practical applications in academic work as well as daily life. Helena's eyebrows rose in an expression that managed to convey surprise, skepticism, and condescension all at once. I wasn't aware that domestic staff were qualified to comment on child development or educational theory. The words hung in the air like a challenge, carrying implications that went far beyond the immediate topic of conversation. Victor felt his own tension rise, not just at Helena's dismissive tone, but at his growing awareness that something significant might be happening with his children, something he didn't fully understand yet, but instinctively recognized as important. Naomi's expression remained composed, professional, but Victor caught a flicker of something in her eyes. Not anger, exactly, but a quiet determination. I worked with my younger brother for 6 years, she said calmly. He had similar visual impairments. I learned various techniques from his therapists and developmental specialists, then adapted them into activities we could do at home. Sometimes the most effective approaches come from lived experience combined with professional knowledge, rather than theory alone. Similar impairments? Victor found himself asking, leaning forward slightly. This was the first time Naomi had mentioned personal experience with visual disabilities, and suddenly her natural competence with his children took on new dimensions. Naomi's expression remained measured, but there was something in her voice that suggested this was personal territory she didn't navigate lightly. Cortical visual impairment. He was born with compromised visual processing due to brain damage during delivery. The doctors said his condition was permanent, that he would never develop functional vision. The dining room fell completely quiet. Even the soft sounds of cutlery against porcelain ceased as everyone at the table focused on Naomi's words. Victor realized that this woman wasn't just another domestic hire with good references. She had personal, intimate experience with exactly what his children were facing. "What happened to your brother?" Lily asked softly, her voice carrying the kind of careful hope that children learn when they've been disappointed too many times. Naomi's smile was the first time Victor had seen her expression become truly warm, unguarded. Marcus is 22 now. He's studying computer programming at Howard University. He still has significant vision challenges, but he learned to work with them rather than around them. He has some light perception and can distinguish basic shapes and movement when the contrast is high enough. Victor felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of his children's situation. For 8 years, every medical professional he had consulted had spoken about the twins' condition in terms of limitation, management, and acceptance. This was the first time he had encountered someone who spoke about similar conditions in terms of development, possibility, and gradual improvement. "Light perception?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral despite the sudden racing of his heart. "It developed gradually over several years," Naomi explained. "The visual cortex is remarkably plastic in children. With consistent stimulation and training, new neural pathways can sometimes develop. It's not a cure. Marcus will never have normal vision. But he learned to use the vision he could develop more effectively than anyone thought possible." Helena shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her disapproval now mixed with something that looked like concern. "I hope you're not suggesting that Lily and Lucas might experience similar improvements. Getting their hopes up would be cruel, especially when medical professionals have been very clear about the permanence of their condition." "I'm not suggesting anything," Naomi replied quietly. I'm simply sharing my family's experience. Every case is different, and there are no guarantees. But I do believe that children are capable of more than we often assume, especially when they're given opportunities to explore their capabilities rather than just accommodations for their limitations. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Victor found himself studying Naomi with new interest throughout the remainder of the meal. She wasn't making promises or raising false hopes. She was simply approaching his children's situation with a fundamentally different set of assumptions. Instead of starting from what they couldn't do, she seemed to be discovering what they could do. After dinner, as the twins were getting ready for bed, Victor found himself drawn to their rooms in a way that had become rare over the past year. Usually, bedtime was handled efficiently by Maria, with Victor stopping by for brief goodnight kisses before retreating to his study to work on the endless stream of contracts, reports, and strategic plans that demanded his attention. But tonight was different. The children's excitement about their day with Naomi had created an atmosphere of possibility that Victor wanted to understand better. He found them in Lucas's room, sitting on the bed while Lily helped her brother organize his collection of textured objects, a hobby that had developed over the years as a way of categorizing and understanding the physical world through touch. Dad, Lucas said as Victor entered, look what Naomi showed us today. He held up what appeared to be a simple wooden cylinder, but his handling of it suggested there was more to the object than met the eye. It's bamboo. Feel here, the surface is smooth, but there are these raised ridges where the segments connect. And if you tap it, it makes a different sound than regular wood because it's hollow inside. Victor took the bamboo section, running his fingers over the surface as Lucas had demonstrated. He could feel the subtle variations in texture, the slight roughness at the segment joints that created tactile landmarks. When he tapped it lightly with his knuckle, it produced a resonant tone distinctly different from solid wood. Naomi says that learning to identify materials by touch and sound helps develop pattern recognition, Lily added from her position cross-legged on the bed. And pattern recognition is important for math and reading and lots of other things. She also says that our brains might be better at some things than other people's brains because we use different pathways, Lucas continued. Like how we can tell what kind of mood people are in just by listening to how they breathe or walk. Victor paused, bamboo still in his hand, struck by the truth of that observation. The twins had always been remarkably sensitive to emotional atmospheres, able to detect tension, sadness, or excitement in adults before anyone else noticed. He had assumed this was simply a survival skill they had developed, a way of protecting themselves in a world where they couldn't see facial expressions or body language. But perhaps it was more than that. Perhaps it was evidence of enhanced capabilities rather than mere compensation for a missing sense. What else did Naomi teach you today? He asked, settling into the chair beside Lucas's bed. The next hour passed in a flood of discoveries his children wanted to share. They described learning to identify different bird species by their flight patterns, how the wing beats of different-sized birds created distinct rhythmic signatures in the air. They had learned that flowers smelled different at various times of day, depending on when they were trying to attract pollinators. They had discovered that the fountain in the rose garden created different sound patterns depending on wind direction, and that these patterns could be used to predict weather changes. As Victor listened to his children's animated descriptions, he realized that Naomi had accomplished something in a single day that their expensive specialists had never achieved. She had made learning an adventure rather than a series of accommodations. Instead of focusing on what the twins couldn't perceive, she was helping them discover rich layers of information available through the senses they could use most effectively. The next morning, Victor made an unusual decision. Instead of heading straight to his study for his customary review of overnight messages from international markets, he lingered near the garden windows, watching Naomi work with the twins. She had set up what looked like a simple obstacle course using garden chairs, lengths of rope, and various objects with different textures and materials. But as Victor observed more closely, he realized the complexity of what she was orchestrating. This wasn't just physical exercise. It was a sophisticated training program designed to develop spatial reasoning, auditory processing, and tactical discrimination all at once. Lucas, there's something new in your path about 3 steps ahead, she said, her voice providing guidance without giving away the solution. Use your ears first, then confirm with your hands. Lucas moved forward with the careful confidence that 8 years of blindness had taught him, but there was something different in his posture. Less defensive, more exploratory. His head was tilted in concentration, processing auditory information with the focused intensity of a professional musician tuning an instrument. His hand found a wind chime hanging at head height, something that hadn't been there the previous day. The chimes were made of different materials, some metal, some wood, some ceramic. Each produced a distinct tone when disturbed by his touch or the morning breeze. Metal, he said immediately, his fingers exploring the chime's construction. Aluminum, I think, because it's light and the sound is bright. And it's moving slightly in the breeze coming from the left side of the garden. Excellent. Now, can you tell me what direction that breeze is coming from by feeling it on your face? Lucas stood motionless for nearly a minute, his expression deeply concentrated. Victor realized he was watching his son process multiple streams of sensory information simultaneously. The feel of air movement on his skin, the direction and intensity of the wind chime's movement, even subtle changes in temperature that might indicate the source of the air current. From the rose garden, Lucas said finally, "It smells like morning dew and new blooms. And it's slightly warmer than the air coming from the other direction, so it must be coming from the sunny side of the house." Victor felt his breath catch in his throat. His son wasn't just identifying objects or following simple directions. He was reading the environment like a complex, three-dimensional map, gathering and synthesizing information from multiple sources to build a sophisticated understanding of the space around him. Perfect. Now, Lily, your turn, Naomi called. But this time, I want you to try something different. Don't use your hands yet. Just listen and tell me what's changed about the space since yesterday. Lily approached the same area where the wind chime had been, her expression intensely focused. She stood motionless for what seemed like an eternity, her head turning slightly as she processed the auditory environment. Victor realized he was holding his breath, caught up in his daughter's process of discovery. "The echo is different," she said finally, her voice carrying a note of excitement at her own insight. "When I speak, my voice sounds closer, like there's something absorbing it instead of reflecting it back. Extraordinary. What do you think might cause that change?" Lily's face scrunched with concentration. "Something soft? Something that would absorb sound instead of bouncing it back like the stone walls do." "Exactly right. There's a tapestry hanging where the chime was yesterday. The fabric changes how sound moves through the space. Can you feel the difference in air movement too?" As Lily explored this new challenge, Victor realized he was witnessing something remarkable. His children weren't just completing exercises or following instructions. They were developing a sophisticated understanding of how to gather and interpret information through non-visual senses. More importantly, they were learning to trust their own capabilities and insights rather than simply depending on adults to interpret the world for them. But as he watched this transformation unfold, a familiar doubt began to creep in. These were impressive skills, certainly. The twins were clearly more capable than he had realized, and Naomi was obviously gifted at helping them develop those capabilities. But they didn't address the core issue that had haunted him for 8 years. His children were still blind. These games and exercises, however clever and engaging, couldn't change that fundamental reality. The medical professionals had been clear, consistent, and unanimous in their assessments. Cortical visual impairment of this severity meant that the parts of the brain responsible for processing visual information had been damaged before birth. No amount of training or stimulation could repair that damage or restore normal vision. He had learned to accept this reality over the years, and part of him wondered if allowing himself to become excited about the twins' progress with Naomi was just setting himself up for another devastating disappointment. 3 days later, Victor's older brother Richard arrived for his monthly dinner visit. Richard represented everything Victor had once aspired to be: successful, traditional, unwilling to entertain what he called false hope or wishful thinking about challenging situations. He had built his own fortune in real estate development, approached problems with ruthless pragmatism, and had never hesitated to share his opinions about how Victor should handle the twins' situation, still letting that woman fill their heads with nonsense. Richard asked as they stood in Victor's study, watching through the tall windows as Naomi conducted what looked like an elaborate version of hide-and-seek in the garden below. The twins were moving through the garden with more confidence than Victor had ever seen them display, navigating between obstacles and locating hidden objects based entirely on audio cues that Naomi was providing. Their laughter drifted up through the open windows, genuine and unguarded in a way that reminded Victor painfully of how they had sounded as toddlers, before the full implications of their condition had become clear. The children seem happier, Victor said carefully, trying to keep his voice neutral. Over the years, he had learned that Richard interpreted any sign of hope or optimism about the twins' condition as dangerous self-deception. Happy. Richard's laugh was sharp, dismissive. Victor, you can't love blindness away. You tried everything. The best doctors money could buy. Experimental treatments in 3 countries. Every specialist and researcher who claimed they might be able to help. At some point, acceptance isn't giving up. It's being realistic. The words stung because they echoed Victor's own fears, the internal voice that warned him against allowing hope to override hard medical evidence. I'm not trying to love anything away. I'm just observing that they seem more engaged, more confident. Confidence built on what foundation? Richard pressed. False hope? The delusion that playing games in the garden will somehow reverse 8 years of medical consensus? You're setting those children up for heartbreak, and yourself along with them. Victor didn't respond immediately, but his silence carried weight. He had spent 8 years learning to manage his expectations, accepting limitation, focusing on helping his children adapt to their condition rather than challenging it. But watching them work with Naomi over the past few days had stirred something in him that he had thought was permanently buried. The woman has good intentions, I'm sure, Richard continued, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he used when he felt Victor was being naive about business or personal matters. But intentions don't change reality. Those children are blind, Victor. Permanently, irreversibly blind. The sooner everyone accepts that, the better off they'll be. That evening at dinner, the atmosphere was tense in a way that had nothing to do with the twins' behavior and everything to do with the undercurrent of adult judgment surrounding them. Richard dominated the conversation with stories from his latest business ventures, occasionally making pointed comments about facing reality and not indulging fantasies that everyone at the table understood were directed at the recent changes in the household routine. Helena, perhaps sensing an ally in Richard's disapproval of Naomi's methods, became more vocal about her own concerns. The children do seem excited about these activities, she said carefully. But I worry that they're losing focus on their real education. Their tutor mentioned that they seemed distracted during yesterday's lesson. The twins sat quietly through most of the meal, their earlier animation dimmed by the undercurrent of adult disapproval. Victor felt the familiar weight of helplessness settling over him again, the sense that he was caught between wanting what was best for his children and being unsure what that actually meant. But then something happened that changed everything. Lily suddenly lifted her head, her expression alert in a way that made everyone at the table pause mid-conversation. Her pale blue eyes seemed to be tracking something that no one else could see, her head turning slightly, as if following movement. "Uncle Richard," she said, her voice cutting through his monologue about quarterly projections with quiet certainty. The candles on the table went out. Richard paused mid-sentence, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. "What?" "The dinner candles," Lily repeated, her voice growing more confident. "They were blown out just now. I can tell because the light in the room changed." The adults at the table exchanged glances. There had indeed been 3 pillar candles burning in the center of the table, tall, ivory-colored candles and silver holders that Helena had chosen to complement the evening's formal place settings. But a cross breeze from the kitchen had extinguished them moments earlier, so quietly that most of the adults hadn't consciously registered the change. That's just a lucky guess," Richard said, but his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. He was staring at Lily with an expression Victor had never seen before, confusion mixed with something that might have been unease. Lucas spoke up next, his voice trembling slightly with excitement. "It wasn't a guess, Uncle Richard." The shadows on the walls shifted when the flames went out. Not completely dark, but softer, less defined. And the temperature changed too, just slightly, but the warm spots from the candles disappeared. Victor felt his heart begin to race. His children were describing visual changes, not imagination, not wishful thinking, but actual visual perception of light, shadow, and the subtle interplay between flame and environment that sighted people took for granted. The dining room fell completely silent except for the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Helena had gone pale, her hand frozen around her wine glass. Richard's expression cycled through disbelief, confusion, and something approaching fear. Even Maria, who had been quietly refilling water glasses, stood motionless beside the sideboard. "Children," Helena said quickly, her voice slightly higher than normal. "You're being rude to your uncle. You should apologize for interrupting." But Victor held up a hand, his movement sharp enough to cut through the tension. "Wait." His voice came out rougher than he intended, heavy with 8 years of suppressed hope suddenly fighting its way to the surface. He stood slowly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Moving deliberately to the sideboard, he retrieved a book of matches from the drawer where Helena kept emergency candles for power outages. His hands were trembling as he relit one of the candles, the flame catching with a soft whoosh that seemed to echo through the room. "Lily," he said, his voice carefully controlled despite the chaos of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "Tell me what you notice now." Lily's face was scrunched in intense concentration, her unseeing eyes directed toward the table's center where the single flame now danced. The bright spot came back. Not everywhere, just in one place. "And the wall behind you looks different now too." "Different how?" "Less dark? Like when clouds move away from the sun outside, but smaller, just around where you're standing." Victor's breath caught in his throat. His daughter was describing the interplay of light and shadow created by a single candle flame. The way candlelight created a small pool of illumination that gradually faded into darkness, the way it cast his silhouette against the wall behind him. With movements that felt disconnected from his conscious will, he slowly extinguished the candle again. And now, the bright spot is gone. Everything went back to how it was before, softer, more even, like the difference between being inside and outside, but much smaller. Victor relit the candle, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the match. And now, brighter again. The gold color on the wall is back. The dining room erupted into chaos. Richard pushed back from the table so abruptly his chair nearly toppled. Helena set down her wine glass with a sharp click, wine sloshing onto the white tablecloth. Maria crossed herself and began murmuring what sounded like a prayer in Spanish. "That's impossible," Richard said, his voice carrying a note of panic that Victor had never heard from his supremely confident older brother. The doctors were clear. Cortical visual impairment it doesn't just improve. Not like this. Not after 8 years. But Victor was no longer listening to Richard's protests. He was moving through the dining room like a man in a dream, adjusting the electric chandelier's dimmer switch. The room gradually darkened, then brightened again as he manipulated the controls. "Lucas," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what do you see?" "Everything gets softer when you turn it down. Like when I'm falling asleep and the world starts to feel far away. But when you make it brighter, everything feels closer, sharper. The edges are more there." Victor felt something breaking open in his chest. Not the familiar despair he'd carried for 8 years, but something entirely different. Something that felt dangerously like hope, but hope built on evidence rather than wishful thinking. "How long?" he asked, turning to face Naomi, who had been standing quietly by the kitchen door throughout the entire exchange. "How long have you known they could perceive light?" Naomi's expression was calm, but Victor could see the careful control she was exercising. "I suspected it 3 days ago, but I needed to be sure before I said anything. Light perception can be subtle, and children sometimes learn to give adults the responses they think are expected. But you were sure tonight. Tonight confirmed it. They're not guessing or responding to environmental cues. They're actually processing visual information, basic light and shadow perception, but genuine visual input nonetheless." Helena found her voice, though it came out strained and unsteady. "This is impossible. We've consulted with the best specialists in the world. They all said the same thing: permanent, irreversible damage to the visual cortex." "The visual cortex is more plastic than medical science understood even 5 years ago," Naomi replied, "especially in children. With consistent stimulation and training, new neural pathways can sometimes develop. It's not a cure. Lily and Lucas will always have significant visual impairments." but they may be capable of more visual processing than anyone realized. Victor sank into his chair, his legs suddenly unable to support him. 8 years of grief, acceptance, and carefully managed expectations were colliding with the evidence of his own eyes and ears. His children, his blind children, were describing visual phenomena with accuracy that couldn't be explained by coincidence or wishful thinking. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked. "Because hope without evidence is cruel," Naomi said simply. "I've seen what happens to families when they're given false optimism. I needed to be certain that what I was observing was real progress, not just my own wishful thinking." Richard, who had been pacing behind his chair like a caged animal, suddenly stopped. "This is insane. You're all acting like this woman has performed some kind of miracle. Children can be very clever about picking up environmental cues, learning to fake responses that please adults. They probably heard the candles go out, felt the temperature change, noticed a dozen other things that adults missed. Then explain this," Victor said, his voice carrying a new authority that surprised everyone at the table, including himself. He moved to stand directly behind Lily's chair, positioning himself so that his body blocked the light from the chandelier above, casting a shadow across her face. "Lily, without moving or using your hands, tell me what changed." Lily sat perfectly still, her face turned upward toward the ceiling. "It got darker on my face. Like when someone walks between me and a window. Something is blocking the light from above." Victor stepped to the side, allowing the chandelier's light to reach her again. And now, the light came back, warmer on my face. The bright feeling returned. Richard's face had gone ashen. That's not possible." "It's not only possible," Naomi said quietly. "It's documented in recent research literature. The brain's ability to develop new neural pathways in response to consistent stimulation is far greater than previously understood, particularly in children whose brains are still developing." Victor felt the world shifting around him, 8 years of assumed reality crumbling and reforming into something entirely new. But underneath the shock and hope, a practical part of his mind was already working. What does this mean? How much vision might they develop? What are the possibilities? "I don't know," Naomi admitted. "Every case is different. Some children develop enough vision to navigate independently, recognize faces, even read large print with assistance. Others plateau at basic light and shadow perception. The important thing is that we continue working with them, help them develop whatever visual processing they're capable of." Helena, who had been silent through most of this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "But what if you're wrong? What if this is just temporary or imagined, or some kind of coincidence? Getting their hopes up, getting all of our hopes up, and then having it disappear would be devastating." The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Victor realized that Helena had voiced his own deepest fear, that this was somehow a cruel trick of circumstance, that tomorrow morning his children would wake up as blind as they had been every day for 8 years. "That's why we document everything," Naomi said calmly. "We work with medical professionals to understand what's happening. We celebrate progress without making promises about outcomes. But we don't stop working just because we're afraid of disappointment." Lucas, who had been listening to the adult conversation with the focused attention he brought to everything important, suddenly spoke up. "I'm not afraid," he said, his 8-year-old voice carrying surprising authority. "Even if the light feelings go away tomorrow, I'm not afraid. Today I could tell when the candles went out. Today I could feel the difference between bright and dark on my face. That's more than yesterday, and more is good." Lily nodded emphatically. "And even if it doesn't get better than this, we learned that our brains can do things we didn't know they could do. That's important too." Victor looked at his children, really looked at them, and realized that something fundamental had shifted in their understanding of themselves. For 8 years, they had navigated the world as blind children, developing remarkable capabilities within that framework, but always defining themselves by their limitation. Now, for the first time, they were glimpsing the possibility that their capabilities might extend beyond what anyone had imagined. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of questions, demonstrations, and careful tests. Victor found himself documenting everything. The specific conditions under which the twins could detect light changes, the accuracy of their responses, the consistency of their reactions. The businessman in him needed data, evidence, measurable proof that what he was witnessing was real, and sustainable. Richard left early, his parting words a mixture of concern and warning. Don't let hope override common sense, Victor. These children have been through enough disappointment. But as Victor tucked his children into bed that night, their faces glowing with excitement about the day's discoveries, he realized that Richard had missed something crucial. This wasn't about false hope or unrealistic expectations. This was about recognizing capabilities that had always existed but had never been properly developed or acknowledged. Dad, Lily said as he leaned down to kiss her goodnight. Do you think we'll be able to see more tomorrow? Victor paused, choosing his words carefully. I think that tomorrow you'll be able to practice using the vision you have today. And maybe, with time and work, you'll be able to develop it further. But even if nothing changes, you've already shown that you're capable of more than anyone realized. Including us. Lucas called from his bed across the room. We didn't know we could see light and shadows. What else might we be able to do that we don't know about yet? The question followed Victor back to his study, where he spent the next several hours researching everything he could find about cortical visual impairment, neuroplasticity, and vision development in children. What he discovered challenged many of his long-held assumptions about his children's condition and its supposed permanence. The medical literature was evolving rapidly, with new research suggesting that the brain's ability to adapt and develop new pathways extended far beyond what had been understood even a few years earlier. Children who had been written off as permanently blind were sometimes developing functional vision through intensive, targeted training. The key factors seemed to be early intervention, consistent stimulation, and approaches that treated the brain as capable of growth rather than fixed in its limitations. By the time Victor finally went to bed, well past midnight, his mind was spinning with possibilities and plans. Tomorrow, he would begin contacting specialists who were working on the cutting edge of vision rehabilitation. He would research programs and therapies that might complement Naomi's work. Most importantly, he would approach his children's future with a fundamentally different set of assumptions about what might be possible. But even as excitement about these possibilities coursed through him, a part of Victor remained cautious. 8 years of disappointment had taught him the danger of unbridled optimism. The twins might have light perception, but they were still profoundly visually impaired. Whatever progress they made would likely be incremental, partial, and hard-won through years of dedicated work. The next morning brought new tests, new discoveries, and new challenges. Victor arranged for Dr. Patricia Chun, a developmental ophthalmologist who specialized in cortical visual impairment, to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of the twins. Dr. Chun was known for her work with neuroplasticity and vision rehabilitation, someone who approached supposedly hopeless cases with scientific rigor rather than defeatist assumptions. What we're seeing is unusual but not unprecedented, Dr. Chin explained after spending 3 hours conducting various tests and assessments with Lily and Lucas. The children definitely have functional light perception and can distinguish basic patterns of illumination. This suggests that their visual cortex has developed some processing capability that wasn't apparent in earlier evaluations. Victor leaned forward in his chair, hungry for every detail. What changed? Why now? Several factors probably contributed, Dr. Chin replied, reviewing her notes. First, the brain continues developing well into adolescence. Pathways that seem non-functional in toddlerhood can sometimes activate later, especially with appropriate stimulation. Second, their work with Naomi has provided exactly the kind of consistent, targeted sensory input that can promote neural development. But 8 years of other therapies didn't achieve this, Helena interjected. She had insisted on being present for the evaluation, her skepticism still evident despite the mounting evidence. Most traditional therapies for cortical visual impairment focus on compensation rather than rehabilitation, Dr. Chun explained patiently. Teaching children to navigate the world without vision rather than helping them develop whatever visual processing they might be capable of. Naomi's approach, treating them as capable of visual learning rather than permanently limited, may have activated pathways that were dormant rather than absent. Over the following weeks, Victor watched his children's world expand in ways he had never dared to imagine. Working with both Naomi and Dr. Chun, they began formal vision training exercises designed to strengthen and develop their emerging visual processing abilities. The progress was incremental but undeniable. Lily learned to track moving objects when the contrast was high enough. A ball rolling across a white floor, a hand waving against a bright window. Lucas developed the ability to distinguish basic shapes, circles from squares, horizontal from vertical lines. Most remarkably, both children began describing their father and other family members in visual terms for the first time in their lives. Not detailed facial features, but general shapes and proportions, the way people moved and gestured, the way light fell across their forms. "You're taller than Uncle Richard," Lily observed one afternoon as Victor worked with her on shape recognition exercises. "And when you laugh, your whole body changes shape, not just your face." "Helena always sits very straight," Lucas added during a family dinner several weeks later, "like a line going up to the ceiling. And her hair catches light differently than Mom's did." The mention of their deceased mother caught Victor off guard, as references to her always did. Elizabeth had died in a car accident when the twins were 4, leaving Victor to navigate their complex medical and educational needs largely alone until Helena entered their lives 2 years later. "You remember Mom?" Victor asked gently. "We remember touching her face, how she smelled, how she sounded," Lily said. "But we never saw her shape, the way she moved in space. Now we can see you and Helena and understand that Mom must have had a shape too." The poignancy of that observation, that his children were now able to conceptualize visual memories of their deceased mother, brought tears to Victor's eyes. For 8 years, he had mourned not just Elizabeth's death, but the fact that his children would never have visual memories of her. Now, while they still couldn't see her face, they were developing the visual framework to understand her physical presence in a way they never had before. But not everyone in their social circle was celebrating these developments. Some of the medical professionals who had worked with the twins over the years expressed skepticism about their reported progress. Dr. Harrison, the pediatric ophthalmologist who had been their primary specialist since birth, was particularly resistant to the idea that their condition had fundamentally changed. "Cortical visual impairment of this severity doesn't simply improve," he insisted during a contentious consultation that Victor had requested. "What you're interpreting as vision development is more likely enhanced auditory and tactile processing that mimics visual responses. The children have learned to use environmental cues more effectively, but their actual visual processing hasn't changed." The debate created an uncomfortable rift between old and new approaches to the twins' care. Dr. Harrison represented 8 years of medical consensus, careful management, and realistic expectations. Dr. Chun and Naomi represented a newer understanding of brain plasticity, rehabilitation potential, and hope grounded in emerging evidence. Victor found himself caught between these competing perspectives, wanting to trust the evidence of his own observations while remaining cautious about overinterpreting what he was seeing. The stakes felt impossibly high: his children's future, their self-understanding, and his own capacity to hope after years of carefully managed expectations. The tension came to a head during a family gathering 6 weeks after the twins had first demonstrated light perception. Victor's extended family had gathered for a birthday celebration, and the twins' progress had become the subject of intense discussion and debate. "I still say it's too good to be true," Richard insisted, his skepticism now tinged with something that sounded like resentment. "Blind children don't suddenly start seeing after 8 years. Either the original diagnosis was wrong, or this is some kind of elaborate self-deception." "Or," Victor replied with growing confidence, "our understanding of what's possible has been limited by assumptions that are proving to be incorrect." The conversation was interrupted by Lucas, who had been quietly playing with a puzzle in the corner of the room. "Uncle Richard," he said, looking up from his work, "you moved to the chair by the window. I can see that your shape is different now, brighter on one side because of the light coming through the glass." Richard froze, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, confusion, and something approaching anger. "That's impossible. You couldn't have seen me move." "I did see you," Lucas replied with the matter-of-fact certainty that 8-year-olds brought to obvious truths. "Not like seeing in picture books, but I saw your shape change from dark to bright when you moved from the shadow into the light." The room fell silent. Victor realized that this moment represented something crucial. Not just evidence of his son's developing vision, but a fundamental challenge to the assumptions that had governed their family's understanding of what was possible. But the most dramatic demonstration of the twins' progress came several days later, during what started as a routine afternoon in Victor's study. Victor was reviewing contracts for a merger that would add another $50 million to his portfolio, the kind of business deal that had once consumed all his attention and energy. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was about to acquire more wealth than most people could imagine, yet the most important developments in his life couldn't be bought with any amount of money. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Dad." Lily stood in the doorway, her expression unusually hesitant. Behind her, Lucas peered around the doorframe with barely contained excitement. There was something different about both of them, an energy that suggested they had something important to share. "We wanted to show you something," Lily said, her voice trembling with anticipation. Victor set down his papers immediately, giving his children his complete attention. They entered the study with steps that were more confident than he had ever seen, moving with the assurance that went beyond their usual careful navigation. "What is it?" Lucas stepped forward, his voice shaking with excitement. "We can see you, Dad. Really see you." The words hit Victor like a physical blow, stopping his breath and making his vision blur with sudden tears. "What do you mean?" "Not everything," Lily said quickly, as if afraid of claiming too much. "Not like the pictures in books or the way other people see, but shapes. Your shape, the way you're sitting behind your desk." Lucas nodded eagerly, his words tumbling out in his excitement to share this monumental discovery. "You're sitting behind the big wooden desk, the one with all the carved edges we like to feel. And there's light coming from the window behind you, so you look like a shadow, but a bright shadow. Like when we put our hands up to block the sun." Victor's hands were shaking as he slowly stood, his movements careful and deliberate. His children were describing his silhouette, the basic outline of his form against the bright window, something they had never, in 8 years of life, been able to perceive. "And your face," Lily continued, her voice growing stronger and more confident with each word. "It's angular, sharp lines, but not scary sharp. Strong sharp, like the corners of the books in your study, but softer. Like when I touch the edges of your jaw when you hug us goodnight," Lucas added, his face glowing with the joy of being able to connect tactile memories with visual perception. "But now I can see the shape too, not just feel it." Victor moved slowly around his desk and knelt in front of his children, bringing his face to their eye level. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, and his hands were trembling with emotion he could barely contain. "What do you see now?" Both twins studied his face with intense concentration, their pale blue eyes moving in ways he had never seen before, tracking, focusing, processing visual information for the first time in their lives. "You have lines here," Lily said, her small finger tracing the air near his forehead with remarkable accuracy. "Worry lines, like the ones I can feel when I touch your face during our bedtime hugs. But now I can see them too. And you're crying," Lucas observed with the matter-of-fact kindness that children brought to emotional truths adults tried to hide. "Your eyes are shiny, brighter than the rest of your face." Victor couldn't speak. The children he had grieved for, the future he had mourned, the limitations he had spent 8 years learning to accept, all of it was shifting before his eyes into something he had never dared to imagine. Not a complete transformation, but a fundamental expansion of what was possible. A movement in the doorway caught his attention through his tears. Naomi stood there, her own eyes bright with emotion she was trying to maintain professional composure around. Behind her, Helena and several members of the household staff had gathered, drawn by the sounds of this remarkable moment. "How?" Victor managed to ask, his voice hoarse with emotion. Naomi stepped into the study, her voice gentle but sure. "Consistent stimulation, pattern recognition exercises, spatial awareness training combined with targeted light therapy. The brain is remarkably adaptable, especially in children. The visual cortex can develop new pathways when it's given the right kind of input over time. I just provided opportunities for them to use abilities that were always there, waiting to be developed." "You gave us more than that," Lily said, turning toward Naomi's voice with a smile that transformed her entire face. "You gave us courage to hope that we might see things. You taught us that our brains could learn new ways to work." Lucas nodded emphatically. "Before Naomi came, we were scared to hope we might see anything. We thought blind meant blind forever, no changes, no possibilities. Now we know that seeing happens in lots of different ways, and our way is just as real as anyone else's way. Victor looked between his children and the woman who had changed all their lives and realized that the most profound transformation hadn't been in their vision. It had been in their understanding of themselves and their possibilities. Naomi hadn't cured his children's blindness. They would still face challenges that sighted children never encountered. But she had done something far more valuable. She had shown them, and him, that vision was about more than sight. That capability was about more than the absence of limitation, and that the most important things in life couldn't be bought, only earned through patience, dedication, and unwavering belief in human potential. Standing in his study, surrounded by the evidence of financial success that had once seemed so important, Victor finally understood what true achievement looked like. It wasn't measured in dollars or acquisitions or board positions or the approval of peers who had never faced real challenges. It was measured in the light that had returned to his children's faces, not just the light they could now perceive, but the inner light of confidence and possibility that had been rekindled. It was measured in laughter that filled the halls of their home again, in curiosity that drove them to explore rather than simply endure, in the courage to hope for more than anyone had said was possible. As Victor embraced his children, feeling their small arms wrap around him with newfound strength and confidence, he realized that he was seeing clearly for the first time in years. Not just with his eyes, but with his heart, his mind, and his renewed faith in the extraordinary capacity of human beings to exceed every limitation placed upon them. Outside the study windows, the afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting longer shadows across the garden where this transformation had begun. But inside, in the warmth of family love and hard-won hope, a different kind of light was just beginning to shine. The light of possibility, of dreams fulfilled beyond all expectation, and of love powerful enough to change what everyone had believed was unchangeable. The twins were still legally blind. They would always face challenges that fully sighted children never encountered. But they were no longer limited by anyone's assumptions about what those challenges meant or what they could achieve despite them. And in that change of perspective, that shift from limitation to possibility, lay the true miracle that Naomi had helped them discover. Victor held his children close and whispered the words that 8 years of grief and acceptance had never allowed him to say. I can see you too. I can see exactly who you are and who you're becoming, and it's more beautiful than anything I've ever imagined. If you made it to the end, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. It truly means the world to us. See you in the next one.